Hayaka. So the question I sent was, the ego is usually seen as an enemy. Is it possible to have a friendship with the ego? And in my case, I realized that the enemy is attachment to identification.
Yes.
To the idea of who I am.
Yes.
And I realized that I really don't know who I am, absolutely.
That's good. Stay with that.
So I guess the question is, is it possible to have a friendship between the false I and the real I?
Okay. The ego isn't really the ego in the strictest sense of the term, in the way we use it here. The ego isn't really the ego if you recognize it. In other words, if the ego is operating in you, you won't even know it. Then it really is the ego. So the ego implies that you're not aware of it. And those people who have the biggest egos don't even know what ego is, and are not interested in learning about ego, and certainly wouldn't think of themselves as having a big ego. They completely cannot recognize the ego as the ego. But what you recognize, of course, the moment you recognize the ego, what you recognize in the way in which I use the term, the moment you see it, is not really the ego anymore. It can be a behavior pattern or a thought pattern that can still operate. For example, you may find yourself name dropping. You know somebody famous and you say, okay, I'll have to call the Dalai Lama in a minute. He is expecting my call. And at that moment you may realize that's actually a lie. And at that moment, of course, you've recognized the ego as wanting to be somebody and to be recognized. And at that moment, you have become present. So it's not the ego anymore. And the next time you can actually observe the urge to say it again or something similar. Okay. Who do you have on your speed dial? I have Oprah on my speed dial. And for 2 minutes you can feel the urge to just wait for a moment, the right moment to let that, bring that up. And there out it comes. And so there were so many instances. You can observe the need to complain to yourself or to others about a situation and about what somebody did, or who do they think they are? They shouldn't do that, and suddenly, or trying to make somebody wrong, and suddenly you know what you're doing and you recognize it as an egoic pattern. The moment you recognize it, some freedom has come in already. The pattern may still operate, but some freedom has come in. There's no longer complete identification with the pattern. And that, I wouldn't say you can make those patterns into your friend, but you can be compassionate with yourself when old patterns still operate that originally came from ego, but because they have a momentum behind them, you're still doing it. Although you now know that really it's the ego, but now it still comes out of you and you can't help it. So the ego then in its strictest sense cannot be your friend, nor should it be treated as your enemy. Because if you treat the ego as an enemy, you give it even more power. So the ego in its strictest sense is neither your friend nor your enemy. It just is something that has taken you over and makes you unconscious. So one mistake is to make the ego into an enemy. That's because really that the ego comes through the back door when you do that, or believing that you can win the battle against the ego. You can't. As soon as you battle, you're part of the ego. The fight against the ego, forget it. Okay. So what you become friendly with, if we can use that term really, is compassion, is for patterns that still occasionally operate in you, that you recognize as coming from unconsciousness, but at the same time they appear in the light of presence. That's why you can recognize them. And instead of beating yourself up for that, which is really you become unconscious again, you simply are compassionate and say, oh, there it is again. I'm doing it again. Isn't that funny? Laughing is a good way of becoming free. When you laugh at your own patterns, when you can do that, and then certain egoic urges, old patterns, you may be able then to catch them after a while when they want to manifest something. You want to say something, you need to express your opinion here, because these people are completely wrong. And let's say it's a situation where whatever you say will make no difference to the situation at all. It's just an opinion. I need to say something. I need to say. You can observe the urge of wanting to assert your mental position here. And then there's the possibility that you can actually be present enough to say, do I have to say it, or can I just drop that? Can I let go of that urge? Let's see what happens if I not suppress it, not say, go away, not like that. I recognize it and then just, okay, I'm going to drop that. I don't need to say that now to assert my knowledge or whatever it is. I can drop it and see how, I mentioned that kind of thing briefly in the New Earth. You can experiment with, instead of needing to say your thing, why do you have to say that? There's no decision making involved right here. Just drop it and see how that feels inside. When you drop an egoic pattern that you recognized, an old egoic pattern, a strange thing happens. First of all, you may feel diminished because you have failed to assert yourself from the egoic point of view in that situation. So you feel, at first you feel smaller somehow, diminished, but that's only the first thing. But as you stay with that, you actually feel a deepening. You go, because the ego always wants to be the mountain. It wants you to stand out, assert, be someone, if only by voicing your opinion or whatever. And the other is the valley. The ego doesn't want to be the valley, which is the opposite of the mountain, you could say. This is the mountain, and that's the valley. And it is not surprising that you can compare some ancient scriptures, like some of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, or the Tao Te Ching, and others. They talk about taking the lower place, not wanting to assert yourself by taking the higher place. Jesus has a parable about finding a seat at a dinner party. Well, a dinner party is not the translation, but basically that's what it is. He says, at a dinner party, don't seek the best seat, seek the lowest seat. Now, this is a parable. It's not advice on where to sit at a dinner party. So it's not to be taken literally. He's not interested where you sit at a dinner party, but it's a symbolic way of saying, if you experiment with being the valley rather than a mountain, not wanting to assert your form identity. I completely disagree with that. You're completely wrong. That's a big assertion. How dare you say that? Etc. Many other ways. So you become bigger the moment you, instead of asserting your form identity, when you drop that, you become a valley, and what happens then? You can begin to sense your essence identity, which has nothing to do with the outer form. So there's real power there when you let go of the ego's need for power, which is pseudo power, and then you become the valley. The Tao Te Ching calls it the valley spirit. Sometimes it's called the mother or the female or the valley spirit, and that is the source of power of the Tao. And the Tao Te Ching teaches you to be in touch with that rather than being that. And the same thing Jesus talks about when he says, take the lower place, not the high place. So it's be in touch with the true power that is not the power of forms, but the power of the formless essence. I call it sometimes essence identity. And so at first it seems a little disconcerting when you let go of an egoic need. Once it's recognized, you can do it. It's just because you haven't asserted your form identity, but then you, after a strange feeling of discomfort, and then you allow that, and suddenly you feel you're actually getting in touch with your own true power. That suddenly, where it doesn't need to do or say anything. It can, but it doesn't. It's not. You would not to assert yourself. That's the true peace, the aliveness, this power of the source, and it's wonderful when you sense that. So
sometimes I fear that I become nobody, so there's strong resistance.
Yes, resistance to that.
In letting go, yeah, I feel disappearing. And
yes, you may find resistance to that. So don't overdo it. Don't force yourself to do it. Do it on small occasions when just as a little experiment. Don't occasionally drop the need to assert your opinion, for example. Or in a discussion, am I right or are you right? Often about the most insignificant thing, people are having a big argument about the most absurd thing. When did this happen? 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago? And before you know it, they are having a violent argument because they are identified with their viewpoint. And occasions like that, the moment you recognize it, if you're discussing whether you are right or the other person is right, it's a good opportunity to let go at some. Otherwise, it can go on and on and on. And I have a few other. I mentioned in the New Earth a few other instances as suggestions where you can use that practice. So, but in the meantime, compassion with old patterns that still operate in you, yes. That's really what is needed. Don't condemn yourself. You're doing fine. You're here. That's a good sign.
Thank you.